a lot of things have changed in the last couple hundred years, and most of it, or at least a lot of it, has been really good. But some of it hasn't been good. And a man named Robert Glover discovered something, one of those changes that hasn't been good, in his therapy practice. He's been a therapist for a long time. He's got a PhD in marriage and family therapy, and he noticed that there was what he eventually came to name the nice guy syndrome happening to a lot of men. And he has spent the last 20 years helping these men recover from this syndrome. And the reason it's a problem is because it causes these men to not live up to their full potential, to have really to really suffer in their relationships and in their sex life, and it produces a lot of frustration in their lives. And he has been able to successfully help these men recover from this. But one of the things I thought was interesting is his description of what has happened, what has changed societally that has led to this syndrome in men. And he's got a list of, I think, 6 things. And they all have added together to basically distance men, young boys growing up, from older men. And one of the first things that happened was the shift from farming to an industrial civilization. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, most boys grew up in the presence of older men, their fathers, their grandfathers, their uncles, their older brothers, their older male cousins, and they worked the farm together. They helped build each other's houses together. They did a lot of stuff together. So these boys were constantly in the presence of older men. So they learned how to be men from men. Well, with the people moving away from that, the man goes to work, leaves, and is gone all day. The amount of time boys are spending in the presence of men just from that has really been reduced. But there were other factors that went along with that. People moved to the cities, and the same thing is really an extension of that. And one of the consequences of this separation from older males is that boys became disconnected from their own natural masculine nature. They were spending more and more time in the presence of women, their mothers, teachers. Another thing that changed is grade school teachers are almost all women. And so boys are being trained by their mothers and by their teachers, their female teachers, how to behave and what gets rewarded and what is approved of. And just naturally, male behavior in boys in grade school is not approved of, which further separates the boys from their natural masculinity. Another big change has been a lot more divorce than there was even 50 years ago. And for most of that time, the kids went to the mother. So the boys are being raised by a single mother, again, distancing him from his father and being around his father. The reason that this is a problem is that in the womb, the brain of a boy changes and becomes a masculine brain. A lot of changes happen to the brain in utero. And then, of course, when his testosterone really kicks in puberty, a lot more things happen. So all of these male-oriented things are happening inside him, and the older men have been through it, know what it's like. The women don't know what's going on. I mean, they don't have the same hormones. They don't know. So they can't really teach him how to be a man. So he becomes, by being separated from older males, he loses the model that he could model his behavior after. And he also loses any wisdom that's passed down and that's been passed down for generations from father to son and grandfather to grandson and uncles to nephews for hundreds of thousands of years. That lineage, that unbroken chain has been broken by all of these changes. Another big change that happened is the women's liberation movement. Many of them became vocally hostile to certain masculine behaviors. And there became almost a stigma of masculinity, which of course influenced boys to further distance themselves from their own, masculine proclivities or impulses. Another factor that Robert Glover lists is as a big change that happened is the Vietnam War. There was all these men who had been in World War II, fought in World War II proudly, and then the Vietnam War came about and their sons rejected it. And the fathers rejected the sons for rejecting it. They couldn't believe it. And the boys rejected everything that their fathers stood for and then raised their boys accordingly. And one other thing that Robert Glover points out is that a lot of boys who are being raised by their mothers are also being told, either directly or indirectly, by their mothers to not be like their fathers that they divorced. Mothers are telling their sons, don't be like him, further distancing him from any masculine characteristics. And I would add to Glover's list something I think is a really big influence, is that people move away more than they used to. They just move away from their family. People are far more mobile than they were only 50 years ago. So if your parents move away from your hometown when you're young, they prevented you from having the influence of your male uncles, your male cousins, older cousins, your grandfathers. It happens to a lot of people. It happened to me. In fact, it's still happening to me. I live in Seattle, for example. My uncles live in Northern California, Southern California, and Nevada. One of my male cousins lives in Southern California, not in the same town as my uncle. My other male cousin lives in Montana. My father lived in Arizona when he was alive. My brother lives in Europe most of the time. Actually, he lives everywhere. He wrote a book about it. Check it out. It's called Gastronomad. My nephews live in Northern California and Las Vegas. My son lives in Thailand. All of the males in my family are separated from each other, so our influence on each other is diminished. Another factor Glover doesn't mention, but I think is also an important factor, is that people are having fewer offspring. Because they're having fewer children, there are fewer uncles. There are fewer older brothers and older cousins, older male cousins. And the result of all of this is a disconnect between the boys and their own masculinity. Boys grow up to repress their natural masculinity, their inborn ways of being and thinking and feeling and behaving, because they have the impression it isn't good. Masculinity has been neutered, castrated. It wasn't a surgical castration or a chemical castration. It was a cultural castration, castration by indoctrination. The result is men who grow up not knowing how to be men and who deny their own masculine proclivities. And this really interferes with the natural order of things in a man-woman relationship. Have you ever seen the movie Bedazzled? There's one scene where Brandon Fraser he's playing a super sensitive guy. He found out that his girlfriend, the girl that he really wanted to be with, just wanted a man who was sensitive, right? So he makes a deal with the devil, and he says, "I want you to make me the most sensitive guy in the world," right? And he's just kind and thoughtful and caring and emotionally vulnerable, and it drives her crazy. There's a great quote in there. But I mean, listen, think about that though. He's sweet, he's kind, he's caring, he's thoughtful. He's exactly the kind of person that a doting mother would want her sweet little boy to be. But it's not attractive. It's totally unnatural to be attracted to that as an adult woman attracted to a mate. She's somewhat conflicted because this is what she wanted, she thought. Finally, in just a burst of frustration, she spits out some honesty. She says, quote, "I just want to be with a man who will ignore me and take me for granted and who is only pretending to be interested in who I am and what I think so he can get into my pants." That's funny because it's a truth that people don't say. So what are the suggestions that Glover makes to get out of this, to recover from this? He has quite a few in the book, and it takes some work, but it's well worth it. You're more at ease. You're more comfortable in your own skin, more relaxed, happier in your relationship and with your sex life, and more likely to be fulfilling your true potential. The first thing I would recommend is reading Robert Glover's book called No More Mr. Nice Guy. One of the things that he recommends is to hang out with men more, especially men who were raised by a father and had grandfathers and uncles in their lives. One of his suggestions is to stop doing things for your woman. Stop doing favors for your woman. This might sound strange, but nice guys are driven to gain approval from women they love. This is what they were trained to do. This is what their mother trained them to do. This is what their grade school female teachers trained them to do, to try to gain approval from them. Nice guys that stop doing this really find that they feel compelled. There's a strong compulsion to do favors and to gain approval. And it's a real freedom to break away from that and to stop doing favors. And he was like, there's sometimes that you do things and you're just doing it because you feel because you care about your woman, right? And then there's sometimes you do it because it's kind of a manipulation, or it's a kind of you're trying to get their approval. And he said, and it's very difficult for nice guys to distinguish between these two. So he said, just don't do any favors. Let her know what's happening, but just stop doing favors for your woman, just to get out of the compulsion. Another one of his suggestions is to stop being low maintenance. Nice guys tend to be low maintenance. They were trained to be that way. They deny their own needs. So one of the practices is to be less low maintenance, to express your needs more, and to seek and to do things for yourself. The bottom line is, if your masculinity has been neutered in any way, it was done by indoctrination and can be undone by you. And if you do, you'll be happier. The end. I invite you to follow me on my blog, adamleecon.com. And if you have any questions or want to say anything to me, write to me at adamcon@usa.com. This is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb. This Atom Bomb podcast episode is sponsored by Anchor, a podcast platform, the one I'm using to make this podcast. It's super easy to use and allows you to easily create your own podcast. You can record and edit your audio right onto the app. In fact, you can do everything on your phone. Anchor also makes it easy to monetize your podcast and get wide distribution. Anchor automatically makes your podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You can download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started.